Who decides what we read?
Me.
In this episode, we're going to look at the ethics of book censorship. And in particular, this was all triggered by a recent news story you may or may not have seen about Roald Dahl's books being censored.
Roald Dahl was one of my favorite children's authors. And that's a special flavor on this discussion. We'll talk about book censorship in general, but we will also touch on the specifics of the fact that this instance that sparked the conversation between us, it relates to children's books.
Exactly.
Yep. Weird and fantastical children's books. Did you know, I think I've mentioned this in another episode, Roald Dahl, most people don't realize, interesting dude, was a spy in the RAF, I think. And also, aside from writing children's books, wrote a lot of short stories, many of quite a sexual nature.
Yeah, quite adult.
Yeah,
theme,
adult,
right?
adult. Yeah, not like smart, but you know, adult. I think one of them is like a guy lost in the desert in Egypt, and he is taken in by someone, and the guy's like, my only request is you don't sleep with my daughter, okay? And you know, in the middle of the night, someone slips into his room. You know, sees this, oh, she's gorgeous and stuff. Middle of the night, he slips into the room. I can't remember that well, but there's like some other suspicious things. There's like locked doors in the house and stuff like that. Anyway, you know, he's kind of.
Is this a spoiler alert?
Yeah. By the way, spoiler alert. It's still funny. I think it's even like the basis of like other short stories and jokes and stuff. But you know, he's quite smug, like, oh, you know, I slept with her and got away with it. The guy's a bit of a Casanova in his history. You know, as he's leaving, he's like, the guy who owns the place is like, I'm so sorry for the, you know, weirdness with locked doors and stuff. To be honest with you, I have the one daughter who's beautiful, the one I asked you not to sleep with. The truth is I have another daughter and she has leprosy. And so, it's kind of implied that he's been sleeping with the girl with leprosy. But
it's a world removed from the likes of like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or James and the Giant Peach.
Yeah, well, I mean, James and the Giant Peach emoji.
Oh my God, seeing it in a whole different light.
But intro. Welcome to the Morality of Everyday Things, guys. I'm Anthony.
And I'm Jacob.
We are your devoted and loving hosts. This is a podcast where we discuss everyday ethics, as you have probably worked out from that intro. Thank you very much to the people who follow us on Spotify and particularly leave reviews. It really helps us jump up that algorithm. It's very low effort and helps you spread the word. Also, literally, feel free to spread the word. It gives us a little fuzzy feeling.
Gives us that dopamine hit.
Yes.
But it actually motivates us as well, which is true. It's been really warming to read all the feedback of people saying that they actually enjoy this and enjoy being part of these conversations.
Oh, and particularly, sorry, a shout out again. I see the stats. I know a lot of you are on iPhones. It's funny, despite getting regular Spotify 5-star reviews, and I think regular Apple 5-star reviews, we haven't gotten a written review on Apple in a long time. So if you do enjoy the show and you have an iPhone particularly, please do leave a written review. It actually really helps, and it helps other people. It's the first thing people see. And particularly the fact that there's just not been written ones for a little while. You know, people are like, oh, does anyone listen to this? And actually, you know, we have Spotify reviews coming in very regularly and just the star reviews on Apple coming in regularly. So if you haven't written one, please do.
By the time you listen to this as well, I was going to say, hopefully, if we order things correctly, this will be the first episode to kick off a new season of recordings.
Well, strictly, I think there was a hot take episode that was supposed to be part of this season, but maybe we'll release a little earlier just so that it's timely with the
news
Gary
cycle
stuff.
Yeah.
But on with the discussion for the day.
On with the show. So, what was the catalyst for us talking about book censorship? Book censorship is obviously, it's not new as a concept. It's and we'll tell you a little bit about the history. It goes back basically to Roman times, if not before, or when how long books have been invented and marketed. But
back in Rome, it was just scrolls. Well, I suppose actually the real proliferation of books was around the printing press.
Yeah.
The Gutenberg printing press, which was 1700s, 1800s?
I was going to say 1400s.
Oh, right. I was way off.
Check with ChatGPT.
I'll
go to for everything.
I'll tell you, it is the 1400s. Yep. I'm way off.
It's a trivia win for me. So, on with the Roald Dahl part, though. The catalyst for this discussion was that Puffin Books, which is a division of Penguin Random House Publishers...
Why is it Penguin Random House?
I presume they merged at some point. I don't know.
Okay, carry on.
They made alterations to passages in new editions of Roald Dahl's books, and some examples, they relate to weight, mental health, gender, race, and this story broke in Britain's Daily Telegraph newspaper, and it caused a bit of a stir.
Wow, you know what? I actually didn't even realise, because I didn't read that specific sentence. You know, I'd have thought there's a lot of weird stuff in Roald Dahl books that I'd kind of like, okay, I kind of get maybe they want to censor this stuff. But I mean, things like relating to weight, mental health, gender, and race. I'm a sensitive soul, and I'm all about being inclusive, making people feel comfortable. But censoring that in old children's books does feel a little bit PC gone mad, political censorship gone mad. Like, we can't call in a children's book, Roald Dahl, part of the comedy of it is that, like, you know, he'll call Miss Trunchbull like
beastly.
beastly or something like that. And then, this idea that, like, no, you can't call someone beastly. It's, I don't know, unfair. Maybe Miss Trunchbull was having a tough time, and that's why. And it's like, well, yes, probably.
She's also
but
just a villain.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a 2D character in a children's book. She's big and ugly. Like, calm down. It's not a statement that women can't be that way or something.
Yeah, exactly. 2D's got an important word there because it is just designed to have a simple character that brings about themes that kids can learn from. Stuff like that. I've got some
don't
examples.
like fat people.
I've got some examples here just to highlight some specifics of what's happened, so you can infer from these the level of censorship that's going on. Famous one, Augustus Gloop, the German kid in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He's goes with Charlie into the factory. He's one of the 5 kids. He's Charlie's gluttonous antagonist, is how they describe it here. This book was published in 1964, by the way, which I had no idea about, but that's, yeah.
That feels kind of recent.
Oh, I was going to say it feels older. I guess Roald Dahl was around in the Second World War, wasn't he? So,
yeah. So that actually makes a lot of sense. Fair enough.
Anyway, he was described as enormously fat, and now he's just described as enormous. I'm not sure that really changes that much, but...
well, no, to be fair, I would say if you called someone... It's a little bit about context, right? But, like, if you call someone enormously fat, it's quite clear. Whereas if you say enormous, it's like, are they really tall and well-built?
Yeah, is
like,
it dense?
Yeah, like, seriously, if someone came to me and said... It depends a little bit on the tone. If someone said I met someone and said, oh, they're enormous, I'd be like, what are they, like 6'5"? Like, really broad shoulders? But it depends. If someone says, I went on a date with someone and they were kind of enormous, then I would...
It's all about the tone now.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's one related to weight. Here's one related to gender. In the new edition of The Witches, a supernatural female posing as an ordinary woman may be working now as a top scientist or running a business instead of as a cashier in the supermarket or typing letters for a businessman.
Interesting. One thing that's interesting about that is also class, isn't? I understand the point of what you're saying there, but also a top scientist or running a business. It's one thing to be like, if it was ridiculously stereotyped around female jobs. It's another thing to be like average people to now like society's elite, right? Like, I mean, what's wrong? Like, I didn't think that being a cashier in a supermarket was a particularly gendered like job. And I would definitely say like a normal person, like a cashier in a supermarket versus like a normal person, like a Nobel Prize winner or the CEO of a FTSE 500 company.
That's true. That's one thing I thought. The top scientist thing in particular. Running a business, fine. But top scientist is like,
even
I'm
running
going undercover.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even running a business, the weird thing is that it has this subtle thing where it turns it more into like an Illuminati novel, where it's like the world's elite are secretly witches, top scientists, business leaders, rather than just run-of-the-mill people.
Yeah. Here's another odd one for you. This seems as if it's related to race, but they're describing tractors here. Keep that in mind. The word black was removed from the description of the terrible tractors in the 1970s book Fabulous Mr. Fox. The Fabulous Mr. Fox, right? The machines are now simply described as murderous, brutal-looking monsters, whereas they were before murderous, black, brutal-looking monsters. That's weird, right?
That's a weird one where it's like, it's one of those one. Have you ever seen that movie Ted? Or like, there's a clip
with Mark
Wahlberg. And they're talking like, we should open it. I think they're doing Coke or something. And they're like, we should open a restaurant. Yeah. And they're like, and it'll do this. And the Wednesday special will be this. And then I think the bear says like, yeah. And like Jews and Muslims and stuff will all be welcome. And it's like, well, yeah, of course they will be. And it's like, yeah, I agree. They will be. That's why we're saying. It's like, wait, why does it need to be said? Who said otherwise? I'm saying it's fine right now. You're saying it's not fine. It's kind of this whole thing. It's like, until you removed the word black,
you didn't know.
I had no hint that like a bunch of, to me instead, that conjures kind of, it's just like when you imagine like scary things, you imagine like dark as in like literally there's not much light. Yeah, it's like until you were like, oh, we should remove that. I didn't think of that as like a racially based thing at all. And now it's like, now I don't really want to argue for it being put back because you've turned it into a racial thing.
Yeah. And then the final one I don't have specific phrasing for, but...
Oh, I remember hearing about this. The twits.
The twits.
To be fair, it's like a husband and wife who are particularly horrible to each other. And I think it was some of the insults to each other.
I believe so.
And I think they toned it down. That was one of the ones I was like, well, it's not insane. Like,
yeah. The twits is really funny though, and
I think he also said some like quite rude gendered things.
That is entirely possible. I didn't get the chance to look up examples of that. I just remember that was actually one of the really picked out ones. As they've had to tone this one down a lot. I presume they call each other like, nasty old hag or something, and things like that will have been tempered. In the revised edition.
Let me see if I can find one. A quote from Rishi Sunak on this. He seems to be against it. His quote is, "We shouldn't gobble funk around the words." Why do Tories have to talk like this?
That sounds like something from that episode of Blackadder where he's taking the piss out of the dictionary.
Yes.
The Twitter's another example. And what's interesting has been, obviously, Roald Dahl is a popular figure. Well, he's certainly a famous figure. His books are widely read and widely loved, and therefore it sparked a bit of reaction. And one such reaction was actually the publishing company's defense was that when publishing new print runs of books written years ago, it's not at all unusual to review the language used alongside updating other details, including new covers, new page layouts. Our guiding principle throughout has been to maintain the storylines, characters, and the irreverence and sharp-edged spirit of the original text. So they're saying these are minor changes intended to make the books accessible to the next generation of Roald Dahl readers. However, people like Salman Rushdie, Booker Prize-winning author, famous guy, wrote the Satanic Verses, got stabbed not too long ago. Do you remember that news story?
No.
Don't know too much more about that. We can come back to that. But he said, Roald Dahl was no angel, but this is absurd censorship. Puffin Books and the Dahl estate should be ashamed. So there's
Did you ever notice that you say absurd in a funny way? You say it the same way as your dad. Who's South African. Carry on.
Wait, how did you say it?
Absurd.
Absurd.
You say
I
it with a
make
Z.
it with a Z, yeah.
Yeah.
That's absurd.
That's absurd.
But anyway, Rushdie, yeah, he thinks it's absurd. Which made me self-conscious about how I say that now. The reference to Dahl not being an angel, that refers to the history of Dahl's anti-Semitism. Not really in the scope of this episode.
Not really in the scope of this episode, but we did do an episode on a similar topic earlier where, can you enjoy the art of problematic artists?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we kind of discuss in that is like, it depends a little bit on the financial relationship between the art and the person. Like, Roald Dahl's dead. It doesn't really benefit him. It benefits his estate, but his estate isn't like created on the basis of anti-Semitism.
yeah.
And the other thing is you have to take it in context. Whilst we disagree with it and it was never okay, like it was a different context, that kind of stuff was more common. Not that justifies it, but it helps you perhaps understand why he may have had those views. And then the other thing was whether or not the stuff that they're making, the views that they have that are abhorrent,
does it feed into the art?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like if Michael Jackson does a song where it's like, I love touching kids, like probably don't listen to that song, right? Or I think the classic example, Blurred Lines, like the subject matter of the art
was
is offensive, right? The fact that the guys who make the music are creeps is a slightly different problem.
Yeah, it depends where you sort of lay down your own moral marker. Definitely a good plug for listening to that episode.
Yeah, Dahl is certainly problematic, and there's definitely questions around that in its own right. Like, should you be supporting the art of a problematic person? But I think we can agree, to be fair, I haven't checked that thoroughly, but I don't think, I've never as a child, I've never read the books and come away thinking, man, I dislike Jews. Like it didn't feel like it was overtly anti-Semitic, right?
Yeah,
and it certainly didn't teach me to be anti-Semitic.
I actually didn't even know this about Roald Dahl until I was looking into researching this episode.
Kind of suppressed a little bit, understandably. I think the other thing that was interesting, and again, nuance, we'll talk a little bit about the history of book censorship, but generally book censorship is more of a problem of freedom of speech. And this is something a little different. There's a sense of freedom of speech, but there's also a sense of paternalism to this one, right? In two or three senses. One, saying what we should and shouldn't say, or like, and a question of like, are they taking this too far? Like, you know what? Is it really unacceptable to have like a fat, ugly character in a like as a 2D way of saying, a little bit like pathetic fallacy is with weather, like bad weather means bad times, like as a kind of external metaphor for the fact that they are ugly in the inside. Are we being patronizing? We're saying children can't understand that. By the way, this doesn't mean every person you meet who's fat or ugly is also fat or ugly in the inside. It's just a very simple metaphor in the context of this book.
I wonder what the phrase for that is, because pathetic fallacy to weather is probably a fair
metaphor
for what that is. Yeah, maybe.
Symbolism?
Like symbolism is maybe what it is.
It's a question maybe a little more around paternalism. And there's also, it's one thing to like remove negative things like that, right? So like, don't have them be fat and ugly and say nothing. The one in The Witches was particularly weird, where like, it's not that you're removing something, you're
actually
now, you're adding
stuff.
Something now, right? Like you're actually adding a feminist message. And the funny thing is, this is like, such a good example of something we discussed in previous episodes where like, I'm pro-feminism. And also it doesn't matter.
I didn't think you weren't until you felt the need to say that.
It goes without saying, like, I'm a progressive, I'm a liberal, etc. But like, it feels weird from the editor. Like, it's one thing if they wanted to remove things like typing letters for a businessman. It's one thing to like remove stereotypical, like you could have just said they're normal people. You could have just like not mentioned jobs, right? It's another thing to take it as an opportunity to shoehorn in, like, because generally I like the idea, like, hey, let's inspire young women and girls who are reading this, like, hey, you can do X, Y, Z. But then, like I said earlier, this is such a weird attempt to like shoehorn it in. It's like, why have we gone from like normal jobs to now like, oh, we're talking about women having jobs, they have to be top scientists and business leaders rather than just normal people.
Yeah,
which is like,
which
yeah, it's
maybe feels like it's distorted the original intention of the
well, the original intention was just to say they're normal people.
Yeah, it was kind of a detail.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
like I said, if you just not mentioned the careers, it actually would have not distorted the intention of the thing. Now it's like, wait, they're not normal people because you're so desperate to shoehorn in this like aspirational stuff for young women that now you've actually changed the nature of the statement. And actually, and like I said, it adds this weird kind of Illuminati flavor to where it's like the witches aren't just normal people who happen, they're actually a cabal of the elites.
And you mentioned this at the beginning, but this is the important theme to Roald Dahl in particular, is the fact that the audience is children. And that's where the paternalism theme is important, because it has that sort of flavor of protecting vulnerable people.
Yes.
But then also, like you say, it's one thing to sort of protect by removing, it's another thing to positively insert messaging. So interesting.
I'll give a really clear example of this, right? A book with the N-word.
Yeah, Mark Twain has loads of those.
Exactly, right? You can't really understand the book. I don't know about Mark Twain's books necessarily, but a lot of the books where, you know, you have people where you will use the N-word, the author is doing this on purpose, perhaps to make a statement about how horrible, you know, the segregation of people is or something like that, right? In that context, to remove that from the book actually fundamentally changes the art.
Maybe a better example would be To Kill a Mockingbird then, where the whole point is like you've got the guy on trial. And the racism is a really important theme. Mark Twain, I feel like, is more incidental because
I haven't read enough Mark Twain to like. I haven't read Huckleberry Finn, so I can, or much of other stuff.
Tom Sawyer and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, here's another example, more extreme example. Lolita. Right.
You can remove references to sort of pedophilia without completely.
The book is about pedophilia, and you know what? As long as you have like a mature response to that, I mean, people complained about it, but like, you know, in that context, like maybe it shouldn't be for kids, right? But in the context of kids, like, okay, books with the N-word, it's probably easier just to not have that for them, right? Like, I get that. Imagine a book trying to teach kids about dealing with race, and it's like, you know, when you see like the joke ones where it's like, mommy and daddy are swingers, like, and the whole thing is like how to teach the kids to, you know, it's like, imagine like the children's book, like someone called dad the N-word, right? Like, no, just don't do that. Just children's books probably shouldn't have that subject matter. The same way that like,
well, it's why we have adult content and parental guidance.
Exactly. In the same way that I made the joke about like, oh, mommy and daddy are swingers, like, yeah, there are people who do that, and that's totally fine. Like, a children's book is not the place to have that discussion. But yeah, the question is, has this kind of swung a little too far? We have a little bit of history on book censorship. I guess a little bit of that we can talk about general, like trying to stop the proliferation of ideas. We can talk about the freedom of speech, but we can also talk about it from a paternalism or propaganda perspective. Yeah, I know that Nazism would be something where that's relevant.
Definitely. And just to give you structure for the rest of the episode, we'll run through the history quickly just to put this Roald Dahl example in context. We'll have a quick ad break, and then after that, we'll debate the two sides of when is book censorship appropriate, when is it not, what are the themes at play, what values are we trading off in order to make the decision of when it's appropriate. So, the history, buckle up, or buckle in, what'd you do?
Up. Buckle up, buddy.
Here we go. In ancient Rome, the government had the power to ban books and even order the burning of books that were deemed to be subversive or dangerous. So that was ancient Rome. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had significant influence over the censorship of books in Europe. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, did I say that right? I have no idea. Or the Index of Forbidden Books was established in the 16th century. It remained in use until the 20th century. The list of books included works by writers such as Galileo, Voltaire, and Rousseau, and it was used to suppress ideas that were seen as threatening to the church's authority, and I presume the church still has, like I said, it still has influence in that.
So let's quickly jump there. I mean, in this case, we're talking basically about the suppression of knowledge.
And values that are deemed contradictory to the church's sort of moral values.
I mean, obviously bad. And that's more a question of limiting free speech, and two, limiting scientific progress.
Is it obviously bad? Because what they're essentially doing is saying, I mean, we have this moral framework. We've got writers that are heretical, that are spreading messages that might.
Well, you know, I guess ironically, I don't know that Yuval Noah
Sapiens,
the guy who wrote *Sapiens*. Yuval Noah
Harari, I think. Yeah.
I'm not saying that he would say Middle Ages Catholic Church is the place to stop. But, you know, a lot of people would say like, well, you know, scientific development ultimately took us to a place where we're destroying the planet, and a lot of people are unhappy. So despite the fact that like a lot of economic indicators say life is good now, maybe the church wasn't all wrong. Hey, like these things undermine like community values and just chilling and loving God. Like, I don't agree with it, but like I could see some argument that that's not terrible.
I might have read him wrong, but I remember when I read *Sapiens*.
Oh, he was like, we should have stayed
I
hunter-gatherers or
got the
something, right?
impression he was like pissed off even at farming. He was like, this was a bad development. We had hundreds of years of evolution, thousands of years of evolution that made us really good hunter-gatherers, and then we abandoned it all for civilized society, and it's actually made us diseased and miserable. And
yeah, I feel like it's so funny. So many things in life I kind of think of as like fast food, where like in the moment it makes sense, but then we kind of neglect or don't understand that like the struggle is the point. Sorry for the people who are very keen on it. I love remote work. I hate work from home. And I generally think it's pretty bad for you to isolate like that. Maybe a day or two a week can kind of make sense. More or less like you're stopping yourself from really engaging in society. I mean, I just can't imagine a world where sitting in your living room for an entire day is better for you than leaving that place.
Having a community of people where you're working towards common goals for the benefit of society.
Your work setup. I can understand as I get older, particularly like things like taking care of your kids and stuff. Like, okay, but I mean, like, it's not the ideal situation. In an ideal world, you'd have support taking care of your kids and live near enough to your work and et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, life isn't perfect.
A theme for a future episode for sure. Yeah. Because there's some, that's a very everyday moral issue right now.
Yeah.
Where were you going with that?
In the context of like sometimes, you know, you do something, it's like, yeah, but this makes my life better.
Yeah.
But actually in the mid or long term, or even just in an understanding of like,
harmful.
Yeah, in an understanding of like, yeah, okay, maybe it like quote unquote improves your health. Are you truly deeply happier? And maybe that's kind of what the guy who wrote *Sapiens* is kind of pointing at. Obviously, being a hunter-gatherer would be a difficult life. In a sense, maybe people would be happier. But he's a weirdo who goes on like month-long silent retreats and stuff. So he has a very specific perspective. And I'm kind of voicing his perspective. I don't know that I necessarily agree with it. But there's, like I said, with the work-from-home example, there are definitely things where it's like, this is like fast food. The negative impacts of fast food are very well known and measurable and medical. But I mean that in a kind of cultural way where like, you know, I could see an argument that TV is the same thing where like, hey, like TV's fun. That's why people buy TVs and watch TV and stuff. You know, then you kind of see this kind of, I don't know, zombie culture of I work so I can go home and sit on my sofa and watch The Office, which like is fun and it's nice brain melt. And I see a place for brain melt. When I imagine on a cosmic scale, like the point of humans existing, it's not to go home and sit on the sofa and watch The Office, is it? Right?
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know if this will be relatable to all listeners, but it's on this point. It's something I've always noticed whenever I've gone hiking or on trips like that. And I find that one, you're in nature. Two, it's like you sort of drop down the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we've talked about in previous episodes. I remember being on like a long trip with school friends where we went hiking in Morocco for a few days in the Atlas Mountains.
Tibidabo. So it was a reference to Friends.
And there was a day where we got lost.
Metaphorically or?
No, like very literally. We went the wrong way for 2 hours, ended up quite close.
Metaphorically or?
It got quite close to the desert, threw us off our route. We came back and then we were running out of water. And I remember thinking at that time, I was like, wow, like all your human instincts at that point kind of kick in and gear towards survival, and everything else that in the plane of existence that we live in modern society, all that sort of melts away because you're like, I need food, I need water, I need shelter, I need to get away from this heat. And it's kind of amazing how well programmed we are when those scenarios arise.
I think another nice example of this is modern dating. And the irony of the paradox of choice and how that applies to a lot of things in our lives, right? Dating, career choices, etc. Being in more difficult, constrained times, in a way, really focuses you.
It does.
And sometimes being focused can help you appreciate the things you have. Another one, this is a weird one, right? Sorry for anyone who's going to fervently disagree with me here.
Go on.
No one is ever going to say like, oh, war is a good thing, right? But I think there's this kind of quiet back of head for a lot of people where like war brings purpose.
Do you think that might be idealizing this sort of very real situation of struggle though, right?
Yeah.
As in you could get that struggle without necessarily.
Yeah, no, war is not necessarily, sorry.
Romanticizing is
war is not the right, war, literally being, for example, an infantry person is not necessarily the thing I'm talking about in this context, but more like the existence of our clear purposes for our country to survive this and push through, and you know, this kind of sense of I'm doing something to contribute, and like, you know, we are together and we're a community, and I don't know, I'm not saying anyone like wishes for war, obviously, because you know, peace is better. Do you understand the point I'm kind of I think pointing at here? Where, like, it gives you purpose.
Yeah,
and every day matters.
I think people, especially in the sort of ways we've evolved tribally, people like having that sense of community purpose, right?
Yeah,
and they like being part of something and knowing that they have a clear role to play.
Yes, exactly. And that it matters.
And war really simplifies that because it suddenly becomes this very clear dynamic.
And I think certainly, I don't have a specific source to back this up, but I think particularly when you talk to like people infantrymen who come back from war, so I guess my earlier thing were like, I don't mean infantrymen, particularly them, like I think a lot of them mentally really struggle coming back because it's a loss of purpose in part,
Yeah.
and also just obviously a very different life context. You know, I'm probably talking total nonsense. This is just you guys. If you've listened to this podcast, you know enough that like sometimes I'll just kind of say the first thing that not to say that I will voice a thought. And then through saying the thought, I'll think it through.
But this is classic us. We've really sort of deviated from history.
From book censorship. There's a nugget here, though.
Yeah.
There's a nugget to that statement, and I suppose listeners probably understand what I'm trying to point out there. Like, dating is probably a cleaner example, where back in the day, you didn't have 1,000 matches on Tinder or whatever. You didn't meet so many people. and in one sense, oh, that's terrible. Like, you got so many fewer options. On the other hand, like, that kind of focuses you. And suddenly there's not all this, like, well, it needs to be perfect or else I'm ending this, right? You understand, like, the reality of a relationship, something you work at. Anyway.
Nice
in
digression.
The modern era.
In the modern era, back to books. Book censorship has been used by governments and other organizations to control the spread of ideas and information. For example, during World War II, both Allied and Axis power groups, they censored books and other media to shape public opinion and prevent dissent. The Nazis did this really famously with the
obviously
book
book
ceremonies.
burnings. But then also, I'm sure on our side, I'm sure that you couldn't get a copy of Mein Kampf.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm sure that it was pretty hard to get your hands on the Communist Manifesto and Kapital. Das Kapital or Kapital?
Das Kapital.
Das Kapital and things like that in the post-Second World War era. I'm sure that's true. However, actually I say that, like, there were definitely neo-Marxist movements within, America and the UK.
They were shamed, though.
Yeah. But I don't think they had trouble getting the literature just because of our cultural inclination to free speech.
I don't know if that's a Western bias, but I got the impression always it was harder to do this in the sort of Axis regions.
Yes.
But who knows?
I think the other thing about book censorship is, at least in the West, I mean, maybe in more authoritarian regimes, true censorship, people don't even hear about the thing. But in the West, where it's, something getting censored makes the news, ironically, like one of the surest ways to ensure people read a book is to ban it.
Yeah, exactly. And this links to the last point, really, which is in the US in particular, book censorship has been a contentious issue since the country's founding because the First Amendment of the Constitution protects freedom of speech and expression. But book censorship has been used at various times to restrict access to materials deemed to be obscene, immoral, or politically subversive. And that's led to court cases and debates about the limits of free speech, the role of government in regulating the dissemination of information. And like you said, it's actually almost a marketing ploy or like a sort of propaganda move. And some of the most famous books that we know of started life as banned items. So you mentioned Lolita. We talked about Salman
Part
Rushdie.
of the reason, I mean, aside from the fact that it is brilliantly written, part of the reason Lolita is so famous is because it was banned.
It's the classic sort of forbidden fruit move of you can't read it, therefore you want it.
Yeah. And actually, just from a practical perspective, given that PR that banning a book tends to give it, it kind of relates back to John Stuart Mill's perception of freedom of speech. This is the freedom of speech part of the book censorship argument. He believed that people should be free to express their views, even if they're unpopular or controversial, as long as they don't like imminently harm others. So that would be, calls to literally take action.
Hate speech.
Well, maybe not even necessarily hate speech, right? Because hate speech, he uses the term, I believe, marketplace of ideas. His point is that, like, look, if someone does hate speech, the marketplace of ideas should naturally sort that for people to be like, well, no, that's bad, and we don't agree with you.
I see.
Whereas, like, if you, again, thinking from a practical PR perspective, if you like ban certain people saying certain things, then that just empowers them to be like, see, they're trying to disempower us. That's what our message is even more important. Whereas like if you just let someone say something stupid or racist, hopefully the marketplace for ideas, i.e. people listening to the variety of opinions that exists, would just lead to people being like, that's stupid and offensive, please stop talking. Or like, I'm not going to listen to you.
That's remarkably reminiscent of the whole Trump era vote stealing and then storm the Capitol kind of stuff, right?
Exactly.
My God. Wow.
Quick quote from him on that.
Yep.
If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. And I think, his point is that, like, justice and practicality are two different things. Yeah, he's basically saying, like, how popular an opinion is doesn't determine how correct that opinion is. And even if everyone disagrees with you, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be allowed to speak. And the kind of natural mechanism is that if everyone disagrees with you, they're not going to listen to you anyway.
So to round off this history section, and then we'll be back with the debate. Today, book censorship remains a controversial issue around the world, with governments and other organizations continuing to restrict access to books and other media that they see as dangerous or offensive. However, there are also many who argue that censorship is a violation of free speech and individual freedom, and that it should be opposed at all costs.
I really think, though, again, we've called this censorship. This is more a question of alteration.
Is that not what censorship means? Or you're sort of talking censorship in the sense of like banning outright.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's okay. So, for example, take the work of Nietzsche. His sister was a Nazi, later published his work and kind of added kind of Nazi flavors to it, right?
Yeah, made him a Nazi icon.
So it's one thing for her to alter his work. It's another thing for someone to say his work is banned because the themes seem Nazi, right? those are like, one explicitly makes it Nazi, and the other one is like, if you read it a certain way, it sounds Nazi.
For consistency with this episode, then, should we treat censorship as the umbrella term for alteration and banning and everything else?
Yeah, I suppose so, because it's maybe literal censorship of a book is to stop it being read or block certain parts of it, delete certain parts of it. But in the wider concept of censorship of ideas, alteration is a method of censoring that idea.
Cool. We'll run with that definition. We're going to have a quick ad break now, and then we'll be back with the debate.
Priceline presents Go to Your Happy Price. What's up? It's Kaylee Cuoco. When it comes to travel, we all have a happy place. You can see yourself already there. It's beautiful. It might be sunny and sandy for some, neon and urban for others, deserts or rainforests or hiking trails. With Priceline, you can get to your happy place for a happy price with deals you really can't find anywhere else. Like up to 60% off select hotels to Costa Rica or 5-star hotels for 2-star prices in Cabo. Go to Priceline.com and travel to your happy place for a happy price. All right, see ya. I'm off to Miami. No, actually, wow, look at that. No, I'm going to Hawaii now. Ooh, Cancun looks nice. You know what? Belize looks pretty nice this time of year. Or, Palm Springs.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
All right, so, Ant, book censorship. There are arguments for, there are arguments against. Really quickly, sort of one sentence summary. Where do you stand? And then we'll get into it. One sentence.
I'm not going to do one sentence. I'm going to do a very short paragraph, right?
Okay.
My argument is, it feels like this is business incentives trying to take advantage of the Roald Dahl brand. If the stuff that he's written is genuinely just kind of becoming old-fashioned, let it die. In the marketplace for ideas, the way to deal with this isn't to alter his works. It's just to let, like, if they're becoming old and old-fashioned, let people stop choosing to give it to their kids.
That is such an interesting opinion. I didn't expect you to say that, although that's very on brand for you. Interesting, because you're saying that they're trying to keep the sale of books alive, and that's why they're trying to update the...
Yeah, exactly. It's easier to trade off the old brand and just update the ideas than it is to just have new children's books that reflect whatever ideas it is that you want. That you want to be promoting, right?
That is classic from you to
turn it into a capitalism thing.
Yeah, but it makes sense because you're right. I mean, you could look at that from a sort of nostalgic, emotional perspective of these are lovely children's books and we want them to be enjoyed by future generations. Therefore, we should take out the less
this is
acceptable.
It's kind of like in the marketplace for ideas, right? Say you're looking for podcasts, right? And you listen to a podcast and it's, I don't know, out of date or not out of date, because then you can ask them to update it. Well, it's different. Say you listen to a podcast and it doesn't quite fit you. Actually, there is a bit of a feedback mechanism. It's not exactly the same, but I don't know. You don't call or message the podcast person saying, "Hey, this episode doesn't quite suit me. Can you re-record it with these changes?" Right? No, you just find a podcast that suits you.
You can give feedback. So to be fair, we've had people write in and say
have feedback.
Don't agree necessarily with that, but obviously
this is different because Roald Dahl's dead. Like, imagine we're not inviting feedback. We were done doing podcasts. Maybe we're even dead, right? You don't message the person who owns the property and say, "Hey, I've decided I'd like it more, be more popular if XYZ." No, you find the product that suits you, right? Or you make it yourself if you can't find it, or you accept it doesn't exist. That's my one sentence view. Inevitably turned into a long one. What's yours?
That's interesting. I wasn't coming at it from that angle at all, but I'm very anti-book censorship in general, which is funny because in general as well, I also... One of my big things with modern society is I think that I like living in a secular society, but I think it lacks a clear, coherent moral framework. It's part of the reason I find doing this podcast so interesting is because if you think about religious societies and stuff like that, they have clear moral values, they preach them, and therefore it makes sense that they approach things like censorship and they have this...
Could we say that, to make an analogy, you are a moral constitutionalist who lives in a world that is a little bit more like the British quote-unquote constitution in that there isn't one. It's a set of norms and rules that evolve over time.
Sure.
And you would rather be in the US where the constitution is written out and set.
I don't need it to be written out and set.
I mean, not literally, but you get my point.
I guess where I'm going with this is why I find my own view interesting is that...
Of course you do.
Well, why I find it almost surprising is that normally I'm actually quite in favor of things that promote values. And I think one of the things that liberalism maybe gets slightly wrong is its obsession with individualism and individual sovereignty. And I think there's a place for community-based values that sometimes we lack as a society that is so individually liberal. But that view would be more coherent with a view that says you should censor things because actually they go against kind of things that we value as a society. Whereas on this issue, I am completely anti-censorship. I think there's no place for it.
Yeah, I think if you I think the other thing is you think about children, right?
Mm.
There is an intermediary here. Kids aren't like drip-fed media direct from the source, right? Like you have parents who are sense-checking these things, and you're gonna have plenty of parents who are giving the old versions of Roald Dahl, not clamoring to get the new versions. But oh, thank God, they say that the witches are FTSE 250 CEOs now, or that what's his name is only enormous, not enormous in fact. Yeah, it's like I said, in the marketplace of ideas, if you don't like this idea, just make or pick another idea. Like, why force alterations that then impart some new meaning as opposed to what that thing was?
Yeah. Well, the other thing I think
and
is
it's also an irrelevant change, really.
The
It's
children.
part of what's annoying.
Yeah, the children dynamic is what makes it interesting, because you'd think if this was all just going out to adults. I think one of the reasons I'm anti-censorship, and I think one of the things I think is important, is to understand things in context and think critically about material for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So when you read Mark Twain and it feels vaguely racist,
Yeah.
you understand that that's a product of its time.
Yes,
and
yes.
You know, you don't sort of. It doesn't change your views on race
This
necessarily.
is another thing with paternalism and patronizing paternalism, right? Like, you can have something that's downright offensive, and sometimes maybe that's good because that teaches children how to deal with that, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe that's a conversation you have around the book, but don't ban the book. You know what? Okay, here's an example of an action that, like, I mean, I probably wouldn't use, but I could make more sense of, certainly morally. Like, add a foreword to the book.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, where you say,
see
hey,
those
this
with
book was written in this
introductions, don't you?
context. We think XYZ. We would suggest such changes, but,
You want to preserve the
to you-
authenticity of the
to present
original.
to preserve the authenticity, we're keeping it this way. Maybe a little context on the author, the time it was written,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, like, you could definitely write something where it's like, hey, cultural norms have changed. Take, for example, the enormous fat becoming just enormous. You could say, you could write a little thing where it's like, hey, look, whatever your motivation is for making that change, just explain it. Just write it there, and then don't make the change. Let people just understand that you don't agree with those words, right?
Yeah.
A business analogy, right? When I want someone to do something or agree with me on something, I don't just say, this is happening, and like censor information that could change their view or explanations.
Which would be an abuse of authority.
Yeah, I explain my view with them and try and turn it around. And then actually sometimes they explain their view and I'm like, actually, fair enough. Yeah, I was wrong. Or, maybe we meet in the middle somewhere because there's truth to both sides.
So with this argument about book censorship in general, there are arguments on both sides, clearly. I think maybe a good way to proceed is I'll give all the arguments that I agree with, and these are the ones
And
why...
ChatGPT presented.
Yeah, exactly. These are the arguments against book censorship. So we can talk about these briefly. But as with this question, and as you're listening to this, I mean, you may have different ideas, you may have different views. This is one of those sort of picture a scale. You're basically trading off what you value more. And I think in this case, I fall very clearly on the side of valuing the arguments against for what they stand for. But
Right.
I can see the arguments for why book censorship has potentially its place. The arguments against are as follows. I'll list the arguments 1 to 5. We've got freedom of speech, which
That's
is
fairly clear.
fairly clear. You've got intellectual freedom, which is the right to seek out and access information as you please. Education and personal growth, which is saying it's good to have access to diverse ideas. Again, develop
Including
your critical
negative
thinking
ones.
skills, including
Right.
negative ones and things you don't agree with.
So for example, to give a funny example, I think that I haven't, but I think that it could be an interesting intellectual exercise to read Mein Kampf.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to agree. Well, I would hope you don't agree with the ideas he presents, but it would help you understand the person who then becomes Hitler.
For sure. Even
Same way checking out his art might.
4, again linked, avoiding ignorance and prejudice, because if everything is censored, you only have access to a narrow range of ideas. It's good to read things you don't agree with as well. It allows you to understand more complex things. And I don't want to say this in a way that sounds sort of trivial, but not everything about the movement of nationalism in Germany in the 1920s was bad, in that,
Right.
you had the sort of...
I get what you mean.
There was a lot of positives around uniting the country in...
Jake, put your hand down. No, I get what you're saying. And the fact that you feel uncomfortable or are struggling to express this opinion is part of the problem, right?
For
the
sure.
fact that, like, it comes to the Greta Thunberg thing where it's like, can we not well, it's
There's
two sides
nuance.
of...
There's an
there's
element
nuance
of
and
nuance.
things. So, like, hey, maybe people who did terrible things also had some. So some people have asked us, what do you think of Jordan Peterson? This is a really good example where, like, you can generally be kind of on the wrong side of things and also occasionally say things that are interesting in their own right, of intellectual value. And we should be able to look at those ideas and appreciate them without having to be like, oh, are you a fan of that guy?
Yeah.
Like, well, no, I just think there's bits of good in every idea, usually.
I'd
I
agree
mean,
with
not every idea, but yeah. Sorry, carry on.
And then this leads to the last point, which is that avoiding censoring books encourages creativity and innovation, which is basically saying if you place restrictions on creative expression,
you don't know where creative expression is going to go or come from, so you kind of don't want limits.
And I think all of these combine together for the reason that I think book censorship is ridiculous, which is that I think people should be allowed to read things in the context they were written, think critically about them.
Yeah.
People should have the right to say what they want.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
actually, your whole marketplace for ideas expression is a nice way of saying if something's unpopular, it just shouldn't gain ground. Whereas if something's unpopular and you ban it, there's no surer way to give it,
not to mention,
to amplify it.
Yeah, not to mention the economics of it. Pricing mechanism, right, effectively works. It's not a literal price, but in the marketplace for ideas, say Penguin Random House is right and people find this stuff offensive. The pricing mechanism will naturally, not literal pricing as in the price of the books, but like demand for those books will naturally fall. I'm just rephrasing exactly what you said, sorry.
No, it's true. That's why your point was actually really interesting, that they have a clear incentive to rescue that. And
And I think part of, actually, one thing that we didn't touch on around free speech and paternalism, and I use the word patronizing, I guess part of it is the question of free will. And this also applies to ads, right? So a lot of people say like, oh, you can't put ads, you're changing people's views, blah, 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 right? And I get
in what
that.
context, sorry, man?
Politics and stuff, right? It's like, oh, using ads on Facebook, whatever, right? Or the hyper-targeted ads, right? But what happens if these ads are hyper-targeted, using this analogy, but aren't lying? Right? It starts to throw into question something of free will. It's like, look, are we going to restrict giving people certain bits of information because it's going to change their mind, as if they are like objects that have things done to them and not beings that have free will and are just taking in information and changing their mind, right? Is the bigger question not, in the context of, say, Roald Dahl, right? If we think calling someone enormous fat instead of enormous, is going to then produce children who go around shouting at fat people like, yeah, you're a bad person, or
don't
whatever.
chase me, I'm full of chocolate.
Don't chase me. Do you not think then that like maybe the problem is a bit deeper and just cutting off the flow of information doesn't really deal with the root problem, in the same way that cutting off ads for Trump or Brexit ads during Facebook leads to people voting for those things? People are like, oh, this is horrible. Wait, these are still people with free will who are being presented. Lies are a special case, but like who are being presented information and changing their mind. Yeah. It's a more fundamental problem. Like stopping the flow of information kind of misses the point.
Interesting analogy. The lies part is definitely the part that really irritated me about the Brexit debate specifically.
Yeah, lies are because then it's cheating.
It is. But you're right. I mean, just the use of social media, hyper-targeted ads was actually quite a smart innovation, loath though I am to admit it.
Yeah. Sorry, just quickly on the lies. When I said that it's cheating, it would be a bit like if I had said to someone, I'll pay you 100,000 if you vote for Brexit. And they said it to lots of people. They kind of did.
350 million back for the NHS, right?
Kind of did. If you kind of said that stuff and then the event came to pass and you just didn't give it, it's like, my frame of reference for thinking this was a benefit to me was false, and you intentionally created that frame of reference or that framework. I think so in that way it's cheating. Like, I could tell everyone I'll give them $1 million. Like, yeah, okay, they'll all work. Like, say for example, I'm giving someone jobs. Like, tell someone I'm going to pay them $1 million a year. It's not like, oh well, they chose by free will. It's like, no, I've lied. I've intentionally preferred. Anyway.
Yeah, the painful thing with that is you just don't have that same accountability with politics, because it's not new that politicians will lie or exaggerate to win votes. Yeah, it's just painful with the Brexit case that it was such a permanent move.
Plenty of people who quote unquote lie in politics. It's in totally good faith. Like, I want this policy. I want to do this policy. I just can't when I come to power. Anyway, sorry. Yeah. Did we talk about the fours?
No, we'll do those quickly just to round off this debate. Yeah.
Okay, so the ones that we have here are protection of vulnerable individuals. This is the only thing that I have a little bit of sympathy for.
Very relevant in the Roald Dahl case.
Yeah, well, it's very relevant in general, although the specific examples we talked through, I was like, are we really protecting anyone there? Saying enormous instead of enormous fat? It sounds like in all of the cases that we went for, the thing that we, except maybe the female one where it was like, oh, we don't want these girls to think that like typing for a businessman is something to aspire, is a normal or thing. Like, I get that. Like, so I kind of get that on the flip side, like that's maybe a positive thing.
And we didn't have the specifics in the twits, but there was some. But it would actually be things like hitting children as well, and stuff like that. But you want to outdate those norms.
Yeah, but most of these, like protection of vulnerable individuals, really it feels like the protection that these changes are trying to offer is more third party. It's more like we want to change the views of the people who are reading this to agree with us, as opposed to I am protecting them from something, right? So the enormous fat, are you thinking that it's going to cause emotional distress to a child? Well, maybe a fat child, actually. Generally, is your concern that it could be both or either? Is your concern that it's going to offend a fat child? Or is your concern that it is going to teach your child to be mean to fat people or think wrong of fat people?
Could be both.
It could be both, in fairness. Preservation of societal norms. I don't buy that. Social norms change. Why do you need to preserve the ones that exist? Like, at no point in history were these social norms, quote unquote, right. They constantly move. That's nonsense.
But this is why the church does it. This is the big explanation for why the church
it's an argument, but it's an argument I disagree with.
I'd say the same thing as you.
I mean, if you were to preserve societal norms 300 years ago, slavery would be okay.
Yeah, for sure. Another one, which is, it sounds very similar, but it's kind of the flip side, prevention of spreading harmful ideologies. So the first is like, we want to preserve what's good and we like about society and we don't want anything coming in.
Yeah.
I suppose this is kind of the same thing, but this is explicitly saying we don't want dangerous ideas undermining our community.
Okay, so I think a couple things. One, we said practically, like, censoring books doesn't work that well, especially in the modern age. Like, even if that's your stated aim, practically censorship is not the best way to do it. And marketplace of ideas, the best way is to actually fight those ideas head on and promote positive ideas. Secondly, particularly to the context of this, it's all much a muchness. I think part of the issue that people take with this is the kind of PC paternalism, because it's like, these alterations are so minor. If I read these books, I would have no sense they were altered, right? Like, nothing fundamental has changed or anything like that. Like, you're changing pretty irrelevant little factors.
Yeah, maintaining community standards is the fourth one, which sounds awfully similar actually to the previous two. Book censorship may be seen as necessary to uphold community standards and prevent offence or discomfort to certain groups.
The last one is a totally selfish capitalist incentive, prevention of legal liability.
Yeah, that's a funny one.
Fair enough.
It's sort of not really a moral argument, is it? That would be the Dahl estate making changes because they don't want future readers to sue them on behalf.
Again, feels a bit irrelevant to this one.
Yeah.
And even then, like, it's a piece of art. Art can be offensive without it being illegal.
Yeah, I think so. So how do you trade these off?
Well, I think we've made our opinions pretty clear talking through the whole thing, right? I clearly lean towards free speech. My overall view is that the main thing with this, as I just said, like 5 seconds ago, 5 minutes ago, 2 minutes ago, I don't know, is that part of what's annoying about these changes is that they're so pointlessly small, right?
Yeah, certainly that would be our view. There might be people who disagree with that, but
True.
Augustus Gloop was pretty big, for example.
But not fat.
Enormous.
I think the Twits one was the most meaningful one, and we couldn't find that super quickly. Yeah, it's...
Here's a point we didn't discuss, but interesting, because one of the things that I felt quite strongly about was preserving the authenticity of the original piece of art. If Roald Dahl was alive and issuing these changes himself, I feel like that would have a very different feeling if he was saying, I'm going to update my work to
interesting. That's
change
another
with the
point.
times, whereas this is stuff that's done
This is
work.
part of what I was saying about, like, capitalist incentives. It's also kind of like, could this be an example of Penguin Random House doing the right thing for the wrong reasons? Right? Like, why is Penguin Random House doing this? Why are they even bother looking at these things? And it comes back to what I was saying. It's easier to sell old rope. Is that the expression?
It is an expression. I don't know.
I don't know if that means... Anyway, it's easier to sell the Roald Dahl stuff. And you know what? Maybe they knew it would get PR attention.
Maybe they were they leaked it to the Telegraph.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, this will get the right wing fired up. My real thing is that, are they doing this for capitalist incentives? And they don't even really care about the quote unquote progressive movements they're supporting by making these changes. Are they really just pandering? Whereas if Roald Dahl did it, like, yeah, I understand that. I think you have to take things in context, right? I mean, like, take the ancient Greeks. What are you going to do? Like, start to censor their views? Like, no, you take it in the context of when it was written. That helps you understand the thing. Are we going to start censoring scary things about World War II in our reading of World War II novels? And where does this end? Like, I understand it's specific because it's children, but, you know, are we going to stop the selling of war novels because we don't want to talk about death in books?
Yeah, that would be ridiculous. An interesting example that we didn't talk about all episode is the Bible itself, because that's actually...
Children read that, and they're told God rains fire on people he doesn't like. Well, if anything, that's a good example of scaring kids into believing things like through lies.
My point was, though, there's a certain amount of hypocrisy in the way that the Bible has evolved, because that's one that's been censored, altered, and revised over centuries, even though it's done by an organization who is prime for this kind of thing because they want to preserve societal norms, but they've meanwhile been updating and revising their sacred text. People might hate me for saying that, but that's definitely historical fact that different revisions and translations have updated the Bible over centuries.
Irony.
Cool, I think that's a good place to wrap up.
Yeah, we'll wrap up there. Let us know what you think. Thank you very much. Don't forget to leave a review and do share it with friends if you have views on book censorship, paternalism, PC gone mad. Oh my God, am I Piers Morgan? Jesus. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. Speak soon.
Thank you, guys. See you next time.
Well, hello there. I'm Simon Mayo.
And I'm Matt Williams.
And we're here to tell you about our podcast, which is called Books of the Year. What, Matt, would you say is at the core of this essential podcast.
Books, mainly fiction, but sometimes non-fiction.
And some very fine authors.
Yeah, we're interested in all the authors. So you've got your best-selling authors, the ones right at the front of the bookshop, the ones on the sides of buses, debut authors, international authors, all the authors.
Apart from the ones who can't actually speak properly because they haven't learnt how to sell their books. There are surprisingly a lot of them.
Really?
They're not going to get on.
Oh dear.
Anyway, we challenge them, we become their best friends, we like authors.
And then dispose of them at the end of the hour. That's what we
right.
do, yeah.
Well, there you have it. So it's books and its authors and its listeners. And if books and authors and listeners are your thing, then the Books of the Year pod should be about the right size for you. Search for Books of the Year on your podcast app now to hear our latest episode with international bestseller Harlan Coben. And follow and subscribe to the pod so you never miss an episode.